I will be speaking in English. I suppose you have translation. So, good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. I want to start by welcoming you and thanking everybody for being here. I also want to thank the CCCB, especially Elizabeth Gula and Ana Ibanez, and to the Diaphora project, which is a Marie Curie project of the European Union funded under the Horizon 2020 program, particularly to Sven Rosenkrantz and Chiara Panizza. They have made this event possible, as well as all of you coming to the debate, which I hope you will enjoy. Our debate today is about a very present concern nowadays, the threat of disinformation and fact resistance. I will say a little bit about this as an introduction before I give the word to our invited speakers here today. And of course, I want to say that the problems of disinformation and fact resistance are not new problems. The name of the event is, as you can see, Cassandra's Dilemma. So who was Cassandra? Cassandra in Greek mythology was the daughter of King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy. Supposedly, Cassandra had been harassed by the god Apollo. She had rejected his advances, and as punishment, she was cursed to always speak truly, make only true predictions, but never be believed by anyone. Of course, the result of this story and the consequences was that the fact that people didn't believe her eventually led to the destruction of Troy itself, the fact that people didn't want to know what she had to tell them. And so this is Cassandra's dilemma or syndrome, that telling what you know is met with disbelief. Knowledge resistance and disinformation are on the rise globally nowadays. Flat earthers, creationists, anti-vaxxers, they all dispute well-established science. Such resistance and disinformation has serious consequences. There are measles outbreaks in Western wealthy countries that have almost eradicated the disease in past decades, for instance, with consequences that many people have now died of diseases that we thought had been eradicated. But there's another grave consequence of fact resistance, namely the undermining of deliberative democracy itself. How is it possible that fact resistance and knowledge resistance assaults democracy, and how should we respond? How can we individually take responsibility for it and act in response? So political opposition and differences of opinion are not only legitimate in democracies, they are in fact fundamental basis of democracies themselves. Representative deliberate democracy is based on two things, among others. One of them that makes it representative is the idea that everybody, all of us, have fundamental equal rights and obligations under the law, and so we have equal rights of political representation. Another is that parties and people with opinions very radically different from our own are also legitimate participants in public life. And so that we have to deliberate with people who disagree with us, such that we can live together. Opposition to power is legitimate in democracy, of course, but it requires a common ground of truth and facts, of trust in rational ways to find out what our reality is, of respect for the legitimacy of differences of opinion, and respect for the rule of law and for the institutions that protect democratic participation and representation. Once we lose these beliefs in institutions, in the rule of law, in rational deliberation, and in facts, our participation in society is no longer based on the principle of reality, but on parochial partisan reasons, on what feels good to us, what protects us from psychological tensions of having to deal with different points of view. We obliterate the legitimacy of views that differ from our own, we become polarized. And then we only listen to what confirms our biases. As we now know, in social media, there are many conspiracy theories. Also, we'll talk a bit about that as well. And once we start to accept this, opposition to our views start to sound like heresy, or like existential threats. When that happens, we have lost the ability to see the other person or the other side as a legitimate player in democratic life. And so disinformation campaigns are wreaking social and political havoc. Lies, contradictions, doublespeak poison the public sphere, often with the help of social media. Fake news sow doubt, deceit, distrust, and fear. Traditional investigative journalism is met with distrust whenever it contradicts what we want to hear. Once belief in an objective reality and knowledge has been eroded, society has become polarized and fractured, with each tribe positing their own alternative views of the world. And now, without the shared common ground of facts and mutual trust, nothing but imposition and violent conflict is possible, because we can't reach across to other people to disagree with us. The most worrying aspect of the loss of a common ground, of standards of truth and knowledge, of respect for democratic institutions, is this: it opens the way for autocratic leaders to take away our rights to participation in democratic society. And so, unsurprisingly, cynicism, division, confusion have been methods that totalitarian and autocratic leaders have used. As Masha Gessen, who has been a speaker here at the CCCB, has said about Putin and Trump, for instance, lying is the message. It's not just that both Putin and Trump lie, it's that they lie in the same way and for the same purpose, blatantly to assert power over truth itself. Totalitarian propaganda, she said in another article, is overwhelming and inconsistent. It bombards you with mutually contradictory claims, which often come packaged in double-think pairs. None of this is new, as I started by saying. It's something that Hannah Arendt already knew, and she had said, for instance, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, that in an ever-changing, incomprehensible world, that the masses had reached the point where they would, at the very same time, believe everything and nothing, think that everything was possible and that nothing was true. So, is there any hope? Yes, I think so, and I hope so. We wouldn't be here if there wasn't any hope. As today's debate will show you, I hope, we must again value trust in each other and value truth, so that we can avoid the pitfalls of tribalism. This will be the lesson of Åsa Wikfor's talk today. Åsa is a professor of philosophy at University of Stockholm. She is a specialist in theory of knowledge, epistemology, and philosophy of language. She has recently written a popular book about fact resistance and alternative facts in Swedish that we are eagerly hoping to get translated into other languages. And also will tell us about mechanisms that lead us to distrust others, to reject their testimony, resisting reality, endorsing only what makes us feel good about ourselves. And today's debate will also give us some insight into how trust in each other can be rebuilt, how we can restore a sense of common ground, not just of belief in a shared reality, but also fundamentally of a belief in shared humanity. This will be the lesson of Adrienne Lemon's talk. Adrienne is Director of Institutional Learning at Search for Common Ground, which is a non-governmental organization. She's a sociologist by training with a background in education programming for at-risk youth, and has worked to support advocacy for conflict sensitivity and do no harm strategies across peace-building, education, and other sectors. After their talks, we will open the debate so that you can all participate. And before we start, I'd like to just say one more thing. It has happened by coincidence that the debate today falls on the day that my country, which is Portugal, is celebrating the 45th anniversary of the revolution that ended the dictatorship. During the dictatorship, of course, political disagreement was banned, censored, state propaganda reigned, and so it's therefore very appropriate to debate with you today about the dangers of disinformation and the value of truth, knowledge, and the respect for the common humanity. And so, without taking more of your time, I give the word to Åsa.
Thank you. Let's see if I can do this now. Let's see. Come on. Now Now it went blank. We shall see. Oh, yes, there we go. Right, alternative facts. That's the name of my book. Of course, there are no alternative facts. I will be explaining why. So we live in this strange time, which they call the era of post-truth. Very strange concept, of course. It's not as if truth has disappeared. It's there whether we like it or not. But it captures something that's going on right now. And I think one can say that it at least has these 4 components. The first, of course, is the new media landscape that we live in, which has been made possible by the new technology, where we used to have a couple of TV channels, a few newspapers and so on to choose from. Now the choice is limitless. You can go out there and find any source you like. And this, of course, has allowed for the, as we say, the marginal voices to reach out for good and for bad. It's good that people can reach out who didn't have a public voice before, but it's also being abused by those who wish to spread disinformation. And that's the other component here. We have an amazing amount of disinformation going around. That, of course, has happened before in the history of humanity, but again, the new technology makes it cheap and easy and global and fast. And then, in addition, part of this post-truth thing is also an increasing polarization that can be seen across the Western world. Of course, in the US, you have very, very extreme polarization effects now, where we've come to the point where people can barely have dinner together because they vote for the different parties. Recently, we heard that the first thing you have to say on Tinder is whether you vote for Republicans or Democrats in the US, right? So it's become this important. When I lived in the US in the 90s, nobody cared which party you voted for in that way. So this is another tendency. And in addition, we have this component that Teresa touched on before, which is this sort of loss of trust, this kind of anti-elite attitudes that's part of the populist movement. All these things interact with each other, and I will explain a little bit. So let's look at one. So there are many manifestations of this, right? One very well-known manifestation was mentioned by Teresa, and that's fake news. So this, of course, is what we were all watching last week with Notre Dame. And the smoke hadn't even settled before there were plenty of fake news out there about it. It's quick, and it's divisive. It's always this kind of thing. You see the first there, Islamist extremists caused the fire. Typical kind of fake news, makes people angry, polarized, and it has this political agenda, or anti-immigration agenda, as fake news often do. The other one, a mosque to be built at the site of the cathedral, pretty amazing one, that came up very quickly. And then the third one is suggesting that Zelensky, who is the presidential candidate of Ukraine, who happened to be in Paris that day, he caused the fire. Right? Now, this works because it makes us angry. And when you get angry and worked up, you don't think twice. You share the information because you're worked up, and before you know it, this has gone right. So, that's one component in this. And then there's this phenomenon of fact resistance that we've heard about. And I will today, because I want to focus on one thing, and I will focus on fact resistance and try to explain what that is. It's such a strange concept, right? Remember these pictures? So this goes back to, of course, when Trump was installed 2 years ago, a little more than 2 years ago, in January 2017. He was standing there at the podium, he was looking out, it was amazing, it was more people than he had ever seen before, and he claimed that it was the biggest audience ever to watch a presidential installment. Now, unfortunately for him, very quickly after they had made these claims, this picture came up from 2009, January, when Obama was first installed. And it certainly looks as if there's a lot more people there, and there was a lot of additional evidence coming in. They were counting subway tickets and so on. That indeed, there was about 30% more people when Obama was installed. But Trump insisted that it was the biggest audience ever, and his spokesperson, Kellyanne Conway, then ran out and insisted on this. And when she was pushed a bit, and they said, but clearly, you know, the facts are that this was more, she coined this term, alternative facts. She said, well, we are just presenting alternative facts. course, there are no alternative facts, right? Facts is about how the world is. There are alternative descriptions of the world, some true, some false, but there are no alternative facts. Anyhow, if Trump kept believing that this is the biggest audience ever, he possibly maybe did, who knows what he really believed, he certainly said it. If he kept believing that, he was manifesting fact resistance. He was resisting the facts. And I will try to explain a little bit how that works. Of course, one can laugh about him thinking that he had the biggest audience ever. It's not such an upsetting thing, maybe. But it's less laughable when it comes to different kinds of fact resistance, such as climate denial, which we now know is causing trouble in the world. Because Trump is a climate denier, the US exited from the Paris Agreement. We now have a climate denier in Brazil who says he's going to cut down the rainforest. So people with power who are climate deniers are certainly causing a lot of trouble. And then we have this, which Teresa mentioned, that because people believe that vaccines, measles vaccines, are dangerous, the vaccination levels have gone down sufficiently for measles to start spreading again. In Europe in 2017, you had a 300% increase. It kept going the same way in 2018. 80,000 people got the measles in Europe during 2018. 74 people died. So it's real. So knowledge resistance has consequences simply because knowledge is important. Knowledge is a value to us. If we're going to prevent disease or cure disease or grow crops so we don't go hungry, we need knowledge. So if one resists knowledge, it will have consequences. Now I will try a little bit to explain what knowledge resistance is, because it's such a strange concept. As you can hear, I don't talk about fact resistance, I rather talk about knowledge resistance, because it really is what it is, and I will explain to you why. It's a matter of resisting knowledge that is available, that one could have had, but that one doesn't want for whatever reason. And let me stress from the start, this happens to all of us. It's not as if those are the people who are knowledge resistant, and those are the other people. It can happen to you, it happens to me, it happens to all of us if we are in that certain kinds of situations. It's important to keep that in mind. So the way to start to figure out what's going on here is to start with a little bit of philosophy, simply, and say a couple of words about what knowledge is, because it has to do with the nature of knowledge that we get into this situation. So Teresa, did you set the time there? Yes, you did. Oh, how good of you. In fact, there are three components here that interact in complicated ways. One is the nature of knowledge that sets things up for us in a difficult way. The other one is these psychological mechanisms that we all have inside of us that sometimes kick in and make this happen. And the third one is this component of disinformation that was mentioned. I will say a couple of words about that. All right, so knowledge, what is that? Well, for those of you who have studied philosophy, some may have, you know that this is a question that philosophers have discussed since antiquity. And in fact, Plato offered a definition of knowledge that's pretty good. I mean, contemporary philosophy have made some tweaks and discussed some aspects of this, but pretty much start out from this definition still. And Plato noted that you need three things to have knowledge. So first of all, you need to have a belief in question. So if I ask you, what's the highest mountain in Sweden? Anyone has a belief about that? Didn't think so. You don't know it. You don't know it. It's Kebnekaise. Try to say that. Right? So in order to know something, you have to have a belief to begin with. Right? So that's the first thing. So if you're a flat earther, if you believe the earth is flat, you can't know that the earth is round because you don't even believe it. So you have to have a belief. But Plato noted, a belief is not enough because sometimes we believe things that are false. So if I believe that the highest mountain in Spain is Mont Blanc, I don't know it. And if you believe the highest mountain in Sweden is Mont Blanc, you don't know it because it's not true. So knowledge requires truth. And that's tricky because, of course, from the inside, it feels exactly the same way whether my belief is true or not. I can be completely convinced that the highest mountain in Sweden is Mont Blanc. And it doesn't matter because it's still false. So you can't tell from inside whether it's true or not. And this is the problem. So what do? Well, the best you can do, and this is the third thing you need for knowledge, You need a belief, and it needs to be true, correspond to how things are, but you need some connection. You need some reason, some grounds, some evidence for your belief, because otherwise, sometimes we just guess. So if I ask you, let's see, I guess something about you guys in here. I guess that 75% of you were born in Barcelona. That may be too much. Maybe more, no? Well, let's say this is true. So 75% of you were born in Barcelona. Did I know it? No, I just made it up. In order to know it, Plato said you need one more thing. You need some kind of evidence, some kind of reason for your belief. And it's when it comes to the evidence and the reasons that things tend to go wrong when it comes to knowledge resistance. Knowledge resistance is really a kind of evidence resistance. That's what it's about. So let me say 2 words about evidence before I move on. How do you know anything? How do you know, for example, today it was raining, I got quite wet. How did I know that? Well, I experienced it. I felt it. I could feel the rain on I could see the rain coming down. And a lot of things that we know from our senses. We know from what we see, hear, feel, smell, taste, and so on. That's how we orient ourselves in our daily lives. That's fine. But when it comes to human knowledge, there's also another way of getting knowledge, which is an amazing way, which is unique to us, something that the animals don't have. We get knowledge from other people who know more. People who've experienced things I haven't experienced, they can tell me through language. Or people who are expert on things that I'm not an expert on. Or people who have investigated things. Journalists can tell me things. So human knowledge is essentially social. We learn about the world from other people. And this is our great strength. It allows us to accumulate knowledge, unlike all the other animals. So even the smartest animals, these are the bonobo chimpanzees, they're very charming, very social, and very smart, but they can't accumulate knowledge that we do, because they don't have anything like human language. And this capacity to accumulate knowledge through language, from individual to individual, from generation to generation, is a great strength, but it also is a vulnerability. Because it means that knowledge requires trust. If you're going to get knowledge from someone else, you need to trust that person. It's the only way. But trust can be manipulated in various ways. And here's a way that disinformation really works. First of all, trust can be exploited. We are very trusting. Our instincts are to be quite trusting. But sometimes people lie and say false things, and then we will end up believing what's false. But trust can also be undermined. So if someone tells you never to trust someone from Sweden, then you won't learn anything from me, because you won't believe what I'm saying. Or if someone tells you don't ever trust established media, then you won't learn about the world from established media, because you don't trust them. And this is very much part of what's going on right now. Okay, so now knowledge resistance then. Knowledge resistance is basically a matter of believing what one wants to believe rather than believing what one has good reasons to believe. It's a way of resisting the evidence that comes to one. And it typically involves skewed reasoning, ways of making, so the evidence comes in, but I feel I don't want to take it in, and it's quite unconscious. So I do things. For example, I do this. When you come and try to convince me of something I don't want to believe, I put very high demands on the evidence for your side, but very low demands when it comes to evidence for my side. And this is how all science denial works, for example. So climate denial, they put a lot of very, very high demands on climate research. So Scott Pruitt, who's the head of the EPA in the US, the first thing when he became head of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, was he went out and had a press conference and said, oh, climate research, that's all very good, but the data are incomplete, we need more evidence, we need more data. And the climate researchers were like, more data? We have so much data. We couldn't possibly need more data to say what we're saying now. So he raised the bar. But then the climate deniers' alternative theories about what's going on, like it's the sun or something like that, they have very, very low bar of evidence for their own position. That's typical of knowledge resistance. You get it with vaccine denial too, which relies heavily on anecdotal evidence. Why are we knowledge resistant? Why do we do this if knowledge is such a good thing to have? Why do we sometimes resist knowledge? Well, it has a variety of psychological sources. One is simply vested interests, if you like. So I like my red wine. I really do like my red wine. But then researchers come, and as they've been doing the last couple of years, saying it causes cancer. I don't really want to believe that. Right? So I will think of a way of resisting that evidence. I'll say, well, surely one day they say it's healthy, the next day say it's unhealthy. You can't trust these scientists one little bit, for example. That's one little theory I would cook up, to have to not take in the knowledge that red wine is dangerous. It can be other things too, other psychological sources. Fears, of course, when it comes to vaccine resistance, fears is a very powerful thing. People worry about their children. They think that there's something very scary about putting some virus into the body of a child. It can be your worldview that comes in the way. So it's known, for example, that climate deniers tend to have a very conservative worldview. This is just a fact about climate deniers. And one can understand it, because if you think about climate denial, if you think about global warming and you take it seriously, you realize that we have to change our ways of living. We have to change our habits in radical ways, our society in quite radical ways. And that, of course, is something you don't like if you're conservative. So there is a connection. But then there's one more thing which I want to end by focusing on, is the social identity needs, as they call it. And social identity needs has to do with our sense of identity with a group, what group we belong with. And this is a very powerful thing in human beings. We belong with a group, we identify with this group. Groups are very important to us historically for survival, and it's in our genes to care very much about our groups. But it comes in the way also when it comes to knowledge. And there is something that there's been quite a few experiments on this in the US especially, but recently in Sweden too, and I know around in other places, where you let people self-identify. So in the US, they self-identify as conservative or as liberal. And then they get to read data about topics that have become politically contentious. Things like vaccines or climate, or in America, a lot has to do with gun control, where the gun control leads to less killings, simply. And they get to read these diagrams, and people who are, and they test their math skills beforehand too. And people who are good at math, when they read a diagram that goes against their view on gun control or vaccines or something, when they read a diagram that goes against their view, suddenly they misread it. They can't read it. They interpret the data so it will not threaten their view. And people on both sides of the political spectrum do this. In Sweden, they did these experiments also when it comes to immigration and crime statistics, and we got the same results. People read the statistics in accordance with the views they already have. And it is this phenomenon which researchers call identity protection. When your group that you belong with, this group is very important to you, and certain factual beliefs about vaccines or climate or whatever are very important to that group, then when evidence comes in against these beliefs, you will protect those beliefs, because it means protecting your identity, your sense of identity and sense of who you are. Now, of course, it's kind of strange that a factual belief should be part of who you are, if you think about it. You know, science, is that part of who I am, to believe certain things about the vaccine or climate? But it can happen. And it happens often because of politics. When it comes to the climate in the US, for example, it's quite interesting that in the 90s, questions about global warming were politically totally neutral. Both sides, both the Republicans and the Democrats, thought that global warming is happening, we need to do something. They had different ideas about what policies to adopt, but they all thought we need to do something. Then Republicans picked up this question about the global warming because there was money coming from the oil industry and they worried that it would cause economic trouble. And they picked it up and it became a political question, global warming. And suddenly it became part of the identity of being a Republican politician not to believe in climate change. So this is how it goes. Politics play a very important role in how a factual belief becomes politicized. An identity marker. Vaccines now, by the way, populist parties throughout Europe are picking up the vaccine question, of making that part of their identity. And that's very scary, because if all the people who vote for these parties also start to become vaccine skeptics, we will have a very big problem. And the very big problem we're heading for, and this connected to what Teresa was talking about, is problem for democracy, of course. Because if we have an increasing polarization, increasing us and them consequences or reactions, and if what factual beliefs you accept depend on what group you belong with, you get a situation where you can't even discuss facts and knowledge and science and truths without the discussion breaking down. And we can't have a democracy when we can't discuss those things in a reasonable way. It doesn't work. All right. Let me just finally say 2 words about the role of disinformation here. My book is called Alternative Facts on Knowledge and Its Enemies. And these enemies, of course, it's a little strong perhaps to call them enemies, but anyway, the enemies are these internal psychological mechanisms that kick in and make us resist evidence. But the enemies are also external enemies, and then I'm talking about disinformation, and especially about these 2 types of disinformation that I was talking about before, the exploitation of trust in spreading false disinformation, such as fake news, and the undermining of trust. Because knowledge resistance interacts with disinformation. For example, vaccine resistance, as you probably know, goes back to disinformation that was created by this researcher, Andrew Wakefield, a researcher, doctor, who claimed that he had found a connection between measles vaccines and autism. And that research has been debunked. It was shown to be fake research. Yet, this information was out there, it was widely spread, people believed it, and it's still believed. So it started out with disinformation, and knowledge resistance often does. Similarly, when it comes to trust, there's a lot of efforts, intentional efforts, to undermine trust in knowledge institutions, such as media, established media, and research. Do you know who this is? This is Rush Limbaugh. He has, for decades in America, long before internet, this was going on, argued these are the 4 corners of deceit, except it's round, of course, but anyhow. Here you have the government, that's one corner of deceit, academia, media, and science. It's all deceit. Don't trust any of them. Now, what happens to democracy when you don't trust the institutions of democracy? It goes under. Finally, final point. So, sometimes in our lives, we encounter people who are, as we would say, knowledge resistant. I mean, we ourselves are sometimes knowledge resistant. Remember that. It's not only others, but sometimes you encounter someone who is. I sat next to a climate denier at a dinner recently. It was interesting. I did everything wrong, by the way. I'm going to tell you what not to do. I'm going to tell you what to do instead of what I did. First of all, remember, knowledge resistance is not an information deficit. It's not as if this person doesn't have the information, typically. They have the information, they don't believe it, right? So you can't just keep telling people, here's how it is, and just bang the facts on their heads. It doesn't work. You have to realize that there's an emotional issue that's going on here. There is something beyond mere information that's needed. And there's quite a bit of experiments and research on what is needed. And we are having a big research program that we will do more experiments on this stuff. But so far we know this much, and I'm happy that the word common ground came in here too. First of all, you have to try to find some common ground if you discuss it, because there's always some common ground. If nothing else, at least maybe you both like the same football team or something. There's always some common ground, both when it comes to values and when it comes to beliefs. So with anti-vaxxers, of course, common ground is that we care for our children. Of course we do. There's always some starting point, but also some common grounds when it comes to beliefs. And do not focus on group identity, because then it's gone. Then conversation ends there. If you focus on differences in what groups you belong to, it's lost. The other thing is, don't get angry, don't get irritated, don't get exasperated, because when one gets angry, the other person will get defensive. We know this. This is how we all work. I work that way if someone gets angry at me. And try to show respect and try to create a situation of trust. And this we also know from experiments. I did none of that with this guy at the dinner that I had. I got angry. It ended up him spilling wine all over the table. It was no good. So it's hard, but it is what one has to do. So I'm just going to leave you with a word of wisdom from an American journalist, which strikes me as very true. Nobody's ever been convinced by having been made to feel stupid. I think that's something to remember. Thank you.
It's okay. Okay, so now we have a hopefully more positive and solution-focused approach. Where is it going to be?
You said 3 like this, and then, look at
that was
me.
Excellent.
All right.
How do you make it? How do you make it big? Okay.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to shift gears a little bit to look at how do we respond when people are in a situation of experiencing disinformation. And one of the things, just before I start this talk, I want to couch this in the fact that there are groups of people, particularly when there are moments of social change, who have an interest in creating disinformation and creating a ground for disinformation to kind of breed, right? And one of the spaces in which that has catastrophic effects is in the case of violent extremism. And so as you think about what Asa has kind of set up here, imagine that you are going through a period of extreme social change. You are frustrated with things happening in your society. Perhaps you feel like you've been denied opportunities, or you're misunderstood, or you don't have a way of fitting in this society as it changes. And somebody comes along and provides all of the things that help you make sense of it. There's a very important aspect here, which is, sometimes the information we have available to us doesn't help us make sense of our situation or doesn't help us fix our situation. We feel powerless. And so that's where violent extremism really takes hold, and other people are able to come in and say, hey, we have a solution. Don't believe these people. Don't believe all of this information. We have something better. And so that's what Search has been sort of tackling over the past few years as violent extremism has become something that we really are grappling with on a global scale. So Search, just to give you a little bit of background, what we do is focus on dialogue, media, and community to solve and transform the way that people solve conflict. And so violent extremism is kind of one of the things that we do, but really looking at how do we create dialogue amongst people, make sure that information is credible, and moves us towards or moves us in the direction of safer, healthier, and just societies where we can all function and speak with one another and resolve our conflicts in a healthy way. So the approach that we have to violent extremism has kind of 4 key pillars. The first is looking at the drivers of conflict. The second is looking at how do we prevent these kinds of events, or how do we prevent a rise in extremism from taking hold. The third is looking at state responses. So one of the issues here is that the state is not always an enabler of good information being accepted. If the state can't be trusted, and then they're spreading information, whether it's true or not, people may not feel like they can accept it or trust that information. So how do we kind of turn that around? And then the last, and this is the one I'm going to focus most on today, is amplifying credible and constructive narratives. So the role of identity and the role of the narrative, the story that you tell about yourself and how you came to be here, is extremely important when it comes to participation in violent extremism. Okay, so we have three things that I want you to keep in mind. One are these kind of structural motivators. So we have things that are the big, kind of the big, large level things that are happening around you that you don't necessarily have control over. So when we talk about the idea of certain groups of people being excluded from the democratic process, kind of a structural barrier, right, that maybe some people can't engage, or low levels of cohesion. So this idea of trends where suddenly we're looking at Democrats and Republicans and they can't come together, and you're just watching it happen and don't really know why, right? Those are kind of the structural barriers. Then there are the enablers. So who has access to what types of information, essentially? And so there will be certain groups of people. When we talk about violent extremism, the case of, I'll just use ISIS as an example, they're actually targeting very specific pockets of the population. So their audience isn't every single person, it's a specific group of people that they've just, that they're targeting because they are perhaps more susceptible to the kinds of information that ISIS is sharing, right? The narrative that ISIS is sharing. And one of the big aspects there is isolation. So if I feel socially isolated, I don't feel like my community cares about me, and somebody comes along and says, hey, we will make you the head of your own city if you come join us. Then I'll feel like, wow, that makes me important. That sounds good. And then they say, you know why you've been kept down? It's because of this group of people, and that's who you blame. And then that resonates with me, because who else am I going to trust? And then there are individual incentives. So particularly in cases of violent conflict where there's a history, you also have individual incentives. My family was killed. I need a job, and I don't have any money, right? And so those are other kinds of incentives that shape how we are able to take in information and how we become susceptible to this idea of disinformation. And so what we try to do here when we look at creating credible narratives and reframing the narratives that take hold in situations of violent extremism are kind of four key areas. So one is reinforcing, and this I think will resonate a lot with the previous talk, reinforcing the power of emotion and human connection. The more that we distance ourselves from each other, or the more that we share information that says that group over there is different from us, the more violent extremism can take hold, the more there's space for that. The second is focusing on how narratives are constructed and shared rather than just their content. So again, you can share facts, but people need to be ready to hear it. And so what's the right format, what's the right space? And this actually varies a lot across different contexts, as you can imagine. But creating a space where people are ready to listen and ready to take in a new narrative or a new vision, a new story about themselves is incredibly important. Choosing credible and resonant messengers is a third part of this. If, for example, we brought here today Donald Trump as the second speaker to talk about disinformation, we may, even if everything he says is right, perhaps that would be, not the right person to share the messages that need to be heard, right? He's kind of a polarizing character. So maybe that's not the person we rely on. We look for people who have the power to unite, right? We look for people who have the power to enact or create trust between communities and between them and their audience. And then the last is engaging and working with professional media outlets to make sure that they have the skills to manage these situations. So what we see a lot, and we are seeing this, I think, globally, is there are a lot of media who are actually unprepared to deal with all of the things that they're seeing, the sort of visceral reaction to media. People are actually not prepared for that. They don't know how to respond. And sometimes they're responding in a way that isn't helpful and it isn't actually bringing people together. Whether they're right or not is a different issue. So we have a lot of risks that come with this type of work. And I'll just cover a couple of the ones that I think are the most important for today. We can often do this type of work and ignore the root causes of injustice. And one of the things that drives disinformation and can drive it further and further is the worst thing that can happen is when you have a truth that resonates with people and you try to ignore it to say, no, this is the right thing. But there's actually a real experience that needs to be acknowledged. And so when we talk about ignoring root causes of injustice, you may say, okay, ISIS is engaging in terrorism, which is bad, and we all agree. But many of the members of ISIS are experiencing other types of injustice, right? That it didn't come from nowhere. And so to try to make people stop participating in violence, but not recognize some of the underlying injustices that have created a vision where people say, I don't have access to certain types of opportunity. I do see my community being torn apart by power dynamics that I have no control over. And to pretend that doesn't exist doesn't really help. And so we can actually make the situation much worse when we try to engage in this work without really thinking about that very deeply and acknowledging the pain that communities often have. And then probably another one here that I just want to comment on is the classic issue that comes up is incomplete or uneven programs. That's probably one of the biggest dangers that happens, where you see these kind of dynamics that happen where we say, okay, violent extremism is super important and everyone in the EU wants to focus on violent extremism, and the US is really interested in that, and they put tons and tons of money into it. And then 2 years later, it's actually migration dynamics, and we're not interested in violent extremism anymore. And so we're changing the treatment, we're changing the interventions, we're changing the strategy all over again. And we tell everybody to close down and shut down their programs. And what happens is there's no long-term vision, and these things take a lot of time to change. And what we're seeing is violent extremists know that. So they actually pay attention to all of these things, and they're very good at using them in their favor. So they've played the long game. They've spent years, decades, actually building these arguments, creating spaces that people feel comfortable in, et cetera, et cetera. And so the challenge is, how do we do this effectively and actually counter what is happening and the momentum that some extremist groups have had? So there are a few lessons that I just want to share with you about the work that Search has done. And Search has been doing this across many different regions. We've done this in Kenya and Tanzania, focusing on the Somali community and sort of al-Shabaab. We've done this in the Middle East, also in Kyrgyzstan, Russia. So very different types of contexts, but looking at this same phenomenon of extremism, the growth of extremism, the mistrust of traditional channels of communication, and also the role that social media plays in that, right? The kind of uncontrolled space that resonates with a lot of young people, and that is used by a lot of young people. We've also done this work in Indonesia and Myanmar, and so there's kind of a wide variety of lessons learned, mistakes made, but also really interesting results that we've had that I want to talk about. So particularly when we amplify narratives and we think about that power of human emotion, one of the things that we want to keep in mind is messages are stronger when they come from people who resemble the groups that are more likely to radicalize. So a lot of times what we try to do is put somebody out there who is perfectly kind of clean, right? They don't associate with that. They don't associate with violent extremist groups. They're not part of those communities, but they're reaching out to them. That's actually the wrong approach. Because people need someone that they feel they can identify with. They need to understand that there's a commonality between them. And so the more they see difference, the more difficult it is for them to take in those messages. And messaging should really de-escalate these divisions. So your role here is, I can relate to you. We're actually the same. We don't have the same, we haven't reached the same conclusion, right? But here's another perspective on our common, here's another perspective about how we can act, even though we have a common and shared experience. And one of the key things to this that people often forget is women and young people are really important to this, right? So, it's often very hard to find like youth leaders or youth who are ready to speak out on some of these issues, but creating space for them to talk about these issues and be candid is the way to deal with this. If you have young people being recruited and you have a 50-year-old person saying, hey, I really resonate with what you're experiencing, that's not really the right formula, right? Because those are two different groups of people with different experiences in the same society. And so looking for young people and women is really important. What we found is oftentimes they may not play the role that we expect them to play, but they're very much engaged. So in Somalia, for example, women will send money via SMS to fighters in Al-Shabaab who are in their families. It's a really important part of the social fabric, actually, of violent extremism. So you have to consider that and take all of those groups seriously. At-risk groups are also not homogenous. So I just talked about youth, that in some cases is 80% of the population, right? So how do we distill down who's actually at risk within a young population to look at, to be vulnerable to violent extremism or the kinds of messaging and the narratives that are created? And what we found is this is, for example, when we talk about religious extremism, it's not all of one religious group that are susceptible. One of the things we found was that it's people who are new to a religious group, new converts, who don't actually have enough knowledge to think critically. They haven't read all of the religious texts, and so they're not able to think critically when somebody gives them information about what it is to be a good Muslim, for example, in the case of Somalia, or a good Buddhist, for example, right? And so this kind of recent conversion actually makes you more vulnerable. These are really important things to pay attention to when you're coming up with your narratives and how you construct them. And sometimes the format is also the problem. So when we talk about, we have done, for example, programming where we created an amazing radio show because radio is, a way that really resonates with a lot of people in certain societies. And then it turns out that nobody listens to the radio because they don't trust the state, and the state controls the radio. So, okay, that was the wrong idea. So what is the right, what is the right space for that? And what we found is we actually really need to do the work to figure out not just what will people listen to or what are the easiest channels to communicate, but where are we going to actually create those connections of trust? I mentioned that credible messengers are not necessarily the people who are different, the people who look clean. What we found is ex-prisoners can be really credible messengers, right, for a specific set of vulnerable groups. And so we've had to think very dynamically about this. When you have people, for example, in Morocco, it was the prison system that became a kind of cycle for, there was no way to go back into society. Well, the only people who could really resonate with that experience were other prisoners. And so that was the group of people that we needed to look at. And then last, just a couple points here, but we need to make sure that there's buy-in from journalists and from a larger media to make sure that this is scalable. So you can do your project, we can have a really good project that's really positive for 1-2 communities. But if you don't get buy-in from a larger system saying this is important and taking up some of these lessons learned, it will remain anecdotal, it will remain small scale, and you won't actually affect the kind of change that you're trying to achieve. Okay, so when this happens well, you can have these interesting types of results. So in Myanmar, 75% of people said they learned something new about a different culture, which is really important in Myanmar, where it's actually not that common that people learn something new about another culture because they're at odds with one another, and there's so much community division because of mistrust between the groups. In Indonesia, social media posts looking at counter-narrative programs and discussing violent extremism increased over time during one of our projects. So you have this really interesting dynamic of people are talking about it. They don't agree, and that wasn't the point. The point was having young people discussing openly and getting rid of the taboo around talking about violent extremism. And it worked, right? In South Sudan, the number of people interacting with somebody from another tribe it basically tripled in 2 years, which is, given the fact that they're experiencing consistent violence and consistent outbreaks of violence, was really significant, that people were continuously increasing how much they would interact and speak with another group. So these are just some kind of concluding thoughts here. But when we talk about this type of messaging and countering this dynamic of disinformation, religion, ideology, talking about that directly is not really an effective way of, and I think we have a lot of similar conclusions here, but talking about those things is really actually not at all an effective way to resolve these issues. Discussing the economic differences between two groups could actually really exacerbate the issues more than focusing on something that they have in common, right? Messaging by itself can have severe limitations, and so you really want to make sure that you create events, you create groups that support conversation, that you have a whole sort of campaign, right, that supports, and what we see is that's what violent extremists do. For the opposite purpose, right? But they do that. They'll meet people in their communities, and then they'll have WhatsApp groups for women who don't really leave their houses, and then they'll also have, social media campaigns and all kinds of things to create a narrative. And so to do the opposite, we actually need to do that kind of work. It's not enough to have facts. And particularly for those who are stigmatized by violent extremism, I should have said stigmatized by our societies. So when you participate or when you have this idea of maybe that's not a bad idea what ISIS did, the idea of saying that's a really bad thing and shaming that just makes it go further under. It makes people close in, and it makes them say, you know, I don't trust all these people, and maybe they have a point. Everybody's always on my back, and I don't know why, right? So getting rid of that, making space for people to come back. One of the biggest barriers is like, I was already violent in some way, and now I can't go back to my family because it's shameful. So getting rid of that shame and making sure that people actually have open space to discuss these issues, which is extremely hard and extremely delicate, but that is necessary for a long-term change. So those are my very broad lessons learned about our work in violent extremism. And like I said, there's kind of 3 other pillars, but the narrative one I thought was most interesting for today. So.
Thank you.
And Teresa, I'm so sorry, I have no idea how long.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I think we can. Okay, so we have time for debate and your questions, please. I'll try to take turns if you raise your hands. There's a question back there.
Hello. A question, something that worries me is that, for instance, when you look at ISIS, they have been creating this for decades. I mean, you can track back to 70s, probably, and then you try to jump in and solve this problem in 4 years, because the 4 years you have an election. That's not going to work. So you need to shift somehow the power to the society to create some more long-term thinking. Because I think that sometimes you are even working against political institutions in that sense, because political institutions are driven by professional politicians who have short-term objectives. So it's like we're trapped in this kind of, people who has a long-term vision of the world, and somehow it's working, politicians who have short-term vision of the world, and it's not working. So how to shift that situation? How to try to gain more control of this process for the society?
Excellent question. So you're absolutely right. I mean, we have these kind of donor cycles that exist on political cycles, politicians who get elected every 4 years or 2 years, right? And it's very fickle. One of the ways that search has managed that, and I'm not going to say it's perfect, but I do think it's an interesting approach, is 90% of the people who work at Search are from and work in and live in the conflicts that are taking place. And so they don't have a short-term interest, they have a long-term interest. And so we try to develop long-term strategies, and then the projects that we kind of piece together around this are the ones that help us further the long-term goal. So even though there are short-term funding cycles, think about, okay, in 2 years I can do this. Hopefully we'll be at this level in 2 years, and then in 2 more years I can do this. And in 2 more years I can do that. And there's a constant process of also reassessment, because all of the conflicts I just mentioned have unexpected outbreaks of violence and all kinds of things that sort of set back, change, the actors change. So yeah, I mean, it's a huge challenge, but one of the most important things I think is having long-term investment from partners and people who want to see their own societies change. And that's partly the reason that the media aspect is so important, and working with larger institutions that are existing in this context to say, okay, if you don't do that part, it's never really going to take hold.
Another question?
Thank you so much for is this on? Thank you so much for all the talks. I think this is a question to both Åsa and Adrienne. It's about the role of emotions. So Åsa said that in order to get knowledge by testimony, we need trust. And this also related to what Adrienne was talking about, that if we want to trust people from other groups, then we need to have something in common with them. It's not just a matter about the content of the information. It's not just about what is said, but also who is the speaker, whether we can relate to them, whether we can share some experiences. But Osa was also talking about the danger of some emotions. When you were talking about fake news, you said that some news, false information that can appear can make people angry. Then if they are angry, they will be more resistant to evidence, more likely to believe things without enough evidence, and more likely to share the news and to spread the fake news. So I was just interested in this idea that emotions can play a really dangerous role, but at the same time, we also need, both of you suggested, that we need to appeal to emotions in how the information is expressed, because just repeating the facts might not be enough.
Yeah, I mean, emotions play a very central and complex role in this, right? Just like you were saying, am I here? Yeah. They can really be a problem, like in the case of fake news. And fake news are designed to make us angry and feel or fearful. And what happens when we do that is that we're not very good at critical thinking. That is to say, we all know that we should double check this source, is this reliable? But when we get all worked up, we don't do it and we share. You know, there was, I don't know if you, I did this 2 weeks ago. Someone, it was terrible, and it wasn't typical. It was kind of a happy news, but still, I got kind of worked up. It said someone had been appointed to something fancy, someone I knew, and I thought, oh, this is great. And I shared the link, and I did the classic thing. I didn't read the text, and if I had read the text, I would have realized that this was a total spoof of this was a joke. But I didn't even read it, right? And indeed, research shows that 6 out of 10 links on Facebook, I think it was, are shared without people even clicking on them. That means you've read the headline. Did any of you get this one? The world is going under in 4 weeks. Did you get that one? It was going around on Facebook 2 years ago. And they were just checking to see how shared it would be without people reading. Because the first sentence, if you read the text, was, this is a test, blah, 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 you know. And yet it was widely shared. And of course, they said, oh my God, the world is going under, right? So it's emotions. So that's the problem. So they can make trouble. And also emotions play a role when it comes to this identity protection, right? It's like, I feel threatened, and I'm going to hold on to this belief because it's part of my group, part of me. But then, of course, also, emotions can play a very positive role. That is the other side of the coin, right? And this is what you were talking about too. One needs to create trust. Even when one feels the divisions are impossible that's really when one needs to try to create trust. Because if we can't even talk about these matters, we're not going to get anywhere. So yes, emotions are central. It's hard for us as philosophers because we just think, oh, hey, just some critical thinking, are you okay? But it's not just that.
I don't know if you want to add something?
Yeah, maybe just to add, I mean, so to give a really concrete example of what I'm talking about when I say emotions, I mean, part of that, it's not the same type of emotion maybe as like igniting anger, or, you know, we're not just saying, okay, you ignited anger, now we're going to try to calm people down. It's more complex than that. So in Myanmar, for example, our media campaign, the core of it was actually a TV drama. And so the idea is that you can provide information to people in a format where they're looking at a main character who they watch go through this, I don't know, who knows what kind of drama is happening in the show, but it has a full season, right? It has ups and downs and challenges, and then it culminates in a season finale, you know, just like any other kind of drama that we would watch. It's entertainment. But think about how many things happen when we watch a TV show. We're looking at it, we're like, oh, that's a really cool computer, I want that. And maybe we pick up certain types of language that people are using. Maybe we pick up hairstyles. Like, the same thing can happen with our values, right? And so it's really about using emotion and using story arcs in the case of Myanmar, and there's different formats, but using that to help people resonate with other ideas. And particularly for extremism, I mean, a lot of people feel that there's no way out, and so all you really need to show is that there's another way, right? So showing people that there's actually another way to solve a conflict, rather than, you know, joining ISIS, is like, oh, okay, I can actually see another window. That could be what somebody needs to not join. So it's emotion, but hopefully in a much more responsible way.
More questions? Thomas? Someone's coming.
Thank you. This goes mostly to Asa, but of course everyone can answer. It seems to me that your notion of knowledge resistance is a little bit biased itself by looking only at motivational factors. There's a long tradition in cognitive psychology which points out that numerous of our cognitive biases are not due to motivations, but due to rather ordinary cognitive mechanisms. So perhaps people are not very capable of dealing with statistical information very well, right? There's a lot of things that people don't do very well when they have to think about, do I get an information about a relative size or an absolute size in a proportion in a sample? That may matter a lot. So one typical example, to take just one very simple example, was, I think in the United Kingdom a couple of years ago, there was some information that anti-baby pills cause an increase of 104% of ovary cancer or something like that, right? Now, depending on how you represent that kind of information, your attitude may change a lot. So if you know, for instance, that, I don't know what the actual figures are, but it's really low. Ovary cancer appears like 1 out of 1,000 in the population of 40-year-old women or something like that. And then you know the anti-baby pill increases the risk of getting that cancer. Only the risk, not the actual certainty. By 104%, that means it's, instead of 1, it's 2 persons in 1,000, right? But of course, there was a lot of media frenzy because people didn't compute the statistical information correctly in that case. That has, I think, very little to do with motivation, but much more with our inability to deal with statistical probabilities. That's one example. Then there is also the case that, and that may play a role very often in statistical information or disinformation, that because the information that you need to acquire a certain hypothesis, think of your red wine example, right, is actually very complicated. So I spoke a couple of years ago to a cardiologist who was at a conference here and asked him, so what's the update on whether natrium chloride increases blood pressure, yes or no? And he said, yeah, finally, we have made, there are new studies coming out now with sample sizes of 10,000 participants who had to be watched over 20 years or more before you can actually make the hypothesis that there is a significant increase of, and he said, okay, yes, the old belief has been confirmed, but actually to get the right belief can be extremely demanding when it comes to such complex issues, right? So, and that has nothing to do, I think, with motivation. And I could go on with other examples.
These are all, there are very many reasons we don't end up with knowledge, right? Sometimes it's sheer reasoning errors. Like you were saying, when it comes to statistics, we are very bad. We know that. That's just something that we all have with us. We make these basic reasoning errors. And there are tons of other reasoning errors that we do, predictably so. That is distinct from motivated reasoning. That's absolutely right. Now, you can call both knowledge resistance if you like, but the standard understanding of knowledge resistance is that it involves motivated reasoning, precisely because it involves not reasoning errors as such, but reasoning driven by a desire to hold on to something. And that reasoning then will cause you to skew the evidence and so on, but it's not a reasoning error that causes it. So that's the difference. And then, of course, there are, yeah, health are good examples, right? Because we know that research, when it comes to what we eat and what we drink, is really tricky, because indeed we have too small sample sizes and often too short periods of time, and so it's really hard to get that knowledge. So there's a lot of stuff we don't know there. That's absolutely right. I think now the connection with wine and cancer, unfortunately, is very well established. But so that's one thing. There's lots of things we don't know, and we just don't have enough evidence. It's too complex, and many of these health issues are often like that, but also societal issues. We don't know everything about the relation between unemployment and this and that. These are complex issues, and no one should go out and claim, we know this. If you don't believe this, you're knowledge resistant. That's silly, right? But the kinds of cases we're looking at when you talk about knowledge resistance are things that are clearly things that are known, right? Or at least where the evidence is overwhelming. As a philosopher, we know that even when the evidence is overwhelming, we may be wrong. There's also that danger, always that danger. But that you may be wrong is not an objection in itself, but it's something we have to live with. But so knowledge resistance is the situation where a belief is overwhelmingly well supported, and yet people resist it through this motivational reasoning. It's that particular case. But again, you may end up not having knowledge for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes you're just being careless and you don't read up properly, and there are all sorts of reasons. But motivated reasoning is the particular kind of phenomenon that typically knowledge resistance is understood as in the psychological literature where this term comes from. And I think it's fair to do that. I think it's a good definition.
When the concept of post-truth appeared, it was usually linked to the notion that people believe more in personal stories and emotional personal stories than scientific facts and things that were evidence. And you've kind of, Adrienne has also kind of mentioned the notion of narrative and how personal stories can be very powerful. So I wanted to know whether or not you think that there is something, and if there is any kind of like logic in terms of like what we know from how cognitive psychology says, that would explain why personal stories are more powerful as a tool to kind of like counteract false information and the risks of this situation.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I mean, it's interesting you talked about narratives, because narratives are so powerful for us, right? Narratives of it's about how we structure the information that come to us. And how we do that depends so much on our background, where we come from, right? So if you're unlucky, I'm just reading this book now, what's it called in English? This Mormon woman has written, What I Learned?
Educated.
Educated, maybe it's called in English. Adrienne, anyhow, she grew up in a very, very isolated Mormon household. Yes. And the worldview that she came with, she didn't go to school. The worldview that she came with, the sort of narrative that she came with to the world when she started going to school, is of course so wide, so way away from our sort of worldview. And of course, when you come with such a worldview, how you interpret the stuff that comes to you will be determined by that worldview that you carry with you. So you will, lots of things that we all find reasonable, she will find crazy, totally wrong, completely mistaken, because of the narrative that you come with. And this is largely a matter of luck. We shouldn't walk around thinking we're all so smart, because it's a matter of luck. If you have bad luck, and if you come from a very isolated situation like that, you will have a very strange narrative that will shape everything, how you interpret everything that comes to you. That's very, very important. And that's much harder. I mean, she in the end did go to school, and she had never heard about the Holocaust when she came to school. It's one of these astonishing stories, right? So that, of course, is a very big thing. And speaking of disinformation and narratives, I think the trickiest, in Sweden now, the trickiest type of disinformation is not fake news. The trickiest type of disinformation is this new narrative about Sweden. So Sweden used to be this great, country, this liberal, fair, just kind of feminist country. And now this narrative that's being told about Sweden is that Sweden is this country that the socialists held that took in too many immigrants and is now on the verge of a collapse. And this narrative is being pumped out by a number of right-wing political platforms, including Breitbart News. And they do it basically by saying true things. How? Well, they pick out a few things, like events, some, car fire in the suburbs, or some violent crime, and they just keep feeding these stories, and nothing about the good stuff in Sweden is being fed. And slowly what that does, it creates a narrative about Sweden being on the verge of a collapse because we took in too many immigrants. And once people adopt that narrative, you're very vulnerable to populist rhetoric and so on. You're very, very vulnerable because that shapes how you interpret the information that comes to you. So narratives are false narratives, as it were. That's what this is. Are much more dangerous than fake news because they shape your entire experience of the world.
I don't know if Adrienne would want to say something.
Yeah, no, I was actually going to say the same thing, this idea that the most dangerous thing isn't something that's totally fake, it's something that's actually true, but is completely blown out of proportion or misrepresented, right? And when you talk about, like, where's the background in social psychology there, I mean, the brain actually has to make decisions. You have to categorize and filter information. And so one of the ways we do that is by understanding who we are, and that's where narrative comes in. It's the story that you tell about yourself, your society, where you come from, all the rules that we create, how do I dress? How do I talk? Do we do kisses or do we shake hands? It's all part of who we are in some way, right? And so all of these behaviors and the expectations that we have of each other are linked to a narrative, and we have limited ability to actually filter all the information that can shape that narrative. So when we have kernels of truth that are misrepresented, that's actually really challenging for people to combat. And that's why, when you have vulnerable groups who are experiencing a truth, I am marginalized, I don't have opportunity, I see things going poorly, economic recession, those create a shift or something where people are like, how do I explain this? They're actually looking for a narrative. And so that's where that kind of information can filter in and be really damaging or create that knowledge resistance. I think that, yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Okay, there's one back there.
Hi. Thank you so much. So you've said that you found yourselves with insufficient results when wanting to connect with certain communities of people, most importantly you, Adrienne, and some of your approach to get to these certain groups of people didn't work. Like you've said that you need people who are close to the receiver to connect. So when you discovered that some techniques weren't working, like how did you know they were not working, and how did you work from there to make up some techniques that did work for that group of people?
Yeah, so a couple of, maybe I can give two examples. So the Myanmar example of the drama that I was talking about earlier, we had trained, sort of everybody on the common ground approach, which is this whole idea of, how do we approach CVE and how to, and how do we approach, resolving violence. And we actually, the only person who wasn't trained on that was the producer of the show. So we got actually to the end of the show, and it was bad. It ended up with the bad guy winning, and like all of these, terrible things. And we were like, this isn't going to work. We can't have this narrative, and realized we had missed a key group, right? So for your program to work, you actually need buy-in from everybody, including the director, producer, who thinks that art is better when the bad guy wins. But that person also needs to be bought in and understand the change and understand what's happening. And so I'll say that's one way, right? You can kind of have the production mechanism and watch it go in a way you did not at all expect. And then what you do is a lot of editing to fix that, or you may change the strategy. So in other places, we've had media formats that didn't actually resonate with the community, and so we went back to our funders and said, you know what, we need to change the strategy and focus more on these other types of media. In some places, comic books are the thing that work better than the radio or that kind of thing. The other example that I'll give is in Kyrgyzstan, we had a real challenge around seeing the type of change that we were hoping for in young people. And about midway through the project, realized that there were some key barriers that we weren't overcoming. So we were hoping to see this really, interesting increase in the discussion, the way that people talked about violent extremism, the trust between groups, the trust between ethnic groups, and that wasn't quite happening. And part of that was the format, again, of the program that we had aired. And so having a redesign and saying, all right, this isn't working, how can we actually increase that? What are we not accounting for? In one of these cases, it was the social media dynamic we just didn't get right the first time we tried it. And so learning, like, what's the thing that's, is it a Facebook group? Is it is it a chat session? Is it that combined with watching a television show? Like, how do you create a space that actually encourages conversation and increases trust? And that's what we measure. So we look at, are we reaching the groups that are relevant? Do they like the program? Do they care about it? Are they participating? And then are we seeing the kind of change that we expect to see? So trust, conversation, the dialogue, those types of things. And all our evaluations are online, so you're welcome to take a look.
Excellent. Okay. I think this is our time, and so let me thank you very much for having accepted the invitation to come and give the talk. I'll accept again the organizers who have helped to put this together, and all of you for coming, and thank you very much.